This is Steve Zelcher with Pacifica. And the struggle of the railroad workers in the United States and the lessons of this fight are very important for all working people. And last week, the U.S. Congress voted to impose a contract without sick pay for 120,000 railroad workers. And we're talking about the railroad company owners like Warren Buffett, who's a billionaire who owns BNSF, not being required to pay sick pay for his workers. Why is this? The question of these billionaires and what's happening in the railroads as far as the failure to have sick pay and the fact that some railroad workers have actually died because they were afraid of going to a doctor for fear of being punished, retaliated for taking time off work. This is a question for more and more workers who are basically being harassed for going to a doctor and have draconian labor conditions. And this struggle has led to a greater anger among railroad workers and other workers around the country who feel that the U.S. government, the Democrats and Republicans, the Biden administration, Marty Walsh, Secretary of Labor, all joined together to say to railroad workers, you're not entitled to sick pay. And joining us today is David Van Deusen. He is the president of the Vermont AFL-CIO, and he just wrote a column in Counterpunch about this issue of what happened to the railroad workers and what that means to U.S. workers and the role of the Democratic Party. So welcome to our show, David.
Thanks, Steve. Always good to talk with you.
So, David, first of all, why don't you talk about what has been happening with railroad workers? Because it's only in the past couple of weeks that there's been a lot of information about their conditions on the rails. It seems this has been going on for many years, the deterioration of working conditions, the cutbacks, and also railroad accidents and the dangers, health and safety dangers for railroad workers and communities.
Look, the big companies, the big capitalist companies have been reducing their staff levels year in, year out for a long time. Can you imagine that in 2022, rail workers don't have a single goddamn sick day, right? So they've been fighting and struggling and trying to prevail at the bargaining table for a long time now to try to secure decent benefits to allow them to be paid when they're occasionally out sick. I believe they proposed 14 days. Now, coming out of this contract that was imposed on them by the United States government, which essentially took away their legal right to strike for this contract cycle, they have now zero sick days. This is not just a tragedy, it's something beyond a tragedy. This is a terrible thing that's the creation of our government. And specifically our government, meaning the Democratic Party, who's in charge of the House and the Senate, who orchestrated this outcome under the direction of another Democrat, President Joe Biden. Every man, woman, and child, working class man, woman, and child in the United States of America should be livid right now. This was an absolute betrayal of working people, of the unions by the Democrats, and we can't brush that under the rug or pretend that because they had the bogus sick leave bill, which was majority voted in favor in the House, and then a majority again voted in favor of the Senate, but they needed to reach the 60-vote threshold to get it through. We can't be fooled by that. The only reason that was created, the only reason that bill was introduced was to give the Democratic Party some flimsy cover so they could point to the Republicans and blame it on them. If they really wanted to stand up for the worker, if they really wanted to get the backs of railroads, unions, if they really wanted to show that they were actually pro-union and not just pro-boss and pro-billionaire, what they would have done in the House is pass a bill saying, all right, here is the tentative agreement, which will become law, and here are 7 or 14 sick days built into that, and then dare the Republicans in the Senate to vote against it. Or even better, when it went to the Senate, it only takes a simple majority to do away with a filibuster. But the Democrats don't want to do away with a filibuster because it serves their need of being able to blame the Republicans for the failures and the shortcomings when it comes to anything that is being driven by the working class or the unions. They want to be able to paint the Republicans as the bad guys. But look, the Republicans are the bad guys. They're an increasingly neo-fascist party coming out of a capitalist interest. But at the same time, the Democratic Party can't be confused as our ally or friend. The Democratic Party is against us. The Democratic Party is organized to represent the interests of the bosses. This is absolutely their failure. They need to own this. We need to make them own this. And we can't get tricked and think that under any circumstances, anybody other than the Democrats made this happen and betrayed organized labor, including Warnock, who folks are celebrating his victory in Georgia today. He voted the wrong way in the Senate. There was only a couple people that voted right in the Senate, and because soon as the sick bill dies in the Senate, the only right vote was to not impose a contract on these workers, to not take their legal right to strike away. Senator Bernie Sanders was on the right side of things. We were in contact with his office during the floor fight. We appreciate his efforts to do the right thing by workers, and there was a handful of others. Warnock was not one of them.
Well, Bernie Sanders, who calls himself a socialist, a democratic socialist, knew that they weren't going to get the 60 votes, and one senator could have stopped a vote on this, apparently, in the Senate. Said, no, there's not, I'm going to challenge it so there's no vote, which would have meant that they would have had the right to strike.
Hey, I think that would have been a good outcome. But when I look at the Senate, there was only one person there that I could see that was doing anything whatsoever to try to show that they actually supported workers and not just were interested in creating political cover for the Democrats. And that's our Senator Bernie Sanders. So look, it's imperfect, even at best. The mechanisms of Congress do not always serve the interest, as you well know, of the working class and the unions in this country. But let's stay laser focused on the fact that this was a Democratic Party betrayal. That party does not represent our interest, and we need to, with sober senses, we need to move forward with building power, which is beyond the Democrats, which is not connected to the Democrats, which does not rely on the Democrats. And we need to build a militant labor movement that's able to put the fearing of God into the politicians to encourage them to do the right thing.
Well, the right to strike is a basic right, and the Railroad Labor Act actually was passed to prevent the right to strike, not only of railroad workers, but airline workers. And this coming year, there's 750,000 workers whose contracts expire, including the UPS workers. A large number of workers are facing it. And the issue of mobilizing the workers and uniting, I think, is an important critical issue. And I noticed today that AFA, Teamsters, and others are united at United Airlines. They're going to have a united campaign. How do you see building a political alternative to the Democrats? Because frankly, there is no alternative, working class political alternative in the United States. And demand like a repeal of the Railroad Labor Act that doesn't even see being taken up by those who say they're against the law. So how do you see forming an alternative working class political party?
Well, let's have a little bit of an eye towards history. It wasn't until the 1930s that we had the quasi-legal right to strike. No matter what the law is, we have an inalienable right to strike, meaning that we're not slaves. And if we choose as a union, as a working class, to throw down our tools and walk off the job site, they can't prevent us from doing that because of some piece of paper in Washington, D.C. So I'm very encouraged that unions like the Teamsters and the airline workers are getting together. And not only that, but we're looking at Sean O'Brien, who was recently elected as the Reform Progressive president of the Teamsters. And then we're talking about Sarah Nelson from the flight attendants, right? These are some very progressive figures in the labor movement who will be part of the struggle going forward. So if the rail unions, for example, were to choose to go on a wildcat strike, and let's not forget that the Postal Workers Union was largely formed around a wildcat strike. This is not unheard of in this country by any stretch, even in recent history. In small ways, ways that aren't going to make the national news, wildcat strikes go on every day. The question is, do we have the internal solidarity and the courage, right? The courage to carry out such actions when we have to, when the laws and the politicians and the monopolies are fighting to suppress us.
And the role of the trade unions, I know that there was not a lot of publicity by the national news. The Teamsters have millions of dollars educating people in this country about the conditions of railway workers. You have a strike now in California of 98 or 48,000 UC workers at the University of California. Governor Gavin Newsom, a Democrat in the Democratic legislature, some of them are on the board of regents. They've been completely silent about this strike. I mean, which is a strike for living wages, a COLA, which is really necessary for all workers in this country. And the issue of housing. Workers in California around can't afford housing. They're being evicted. They have to commute hours and hours. I mean, it seems like these strikes really are taking on the national issues facing all working people. And do you think they need to be brought together? And also, the Democrats, who the unions have given money, hundreds of millions of dollars, can't take a side in the midst of a struggle for living wage and housing?
Well, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, right? Shame on me. The Democrats have been doing this for generations. They're not our friends, and we can't allow an illusion of them being allies to define any sort of tactical or strategic approach we take to these labor struggles in aggregate. What we need to be doing, they passed labor reform laws, meaningful ones in the 30s, not because they liked us, not because we were buddies, but because they feared us. And they feared us because of mass strike actions going on, mass rallies in the streets, because workers together as a working class were standing up and saying enough is enough. So it's when we grow our own power internally to the point, and we're not afraid to use it, and we show we're not afraid to use it, that's when the politicians start to becoming more sensitive to our desires. And so with that fear, with that power comes change. And that's the direction we need to be going to. If we were to take a fraction of the tens of millions of dollars the National Labor Movement currently puts into elections supporting shitty candidates that don't get our back, right? If we were to take money out of that and put that into organizing, send organizers to every state to develop a real communication network across this country for working people, our own media, our own radio, right? Our own internet channels. These are ways that we could start to become stronger and more united as a working class. But to do that, we have to pivot. We have to first name our enemy, and our enemy is not just the neo-fascist Republican Party, which they are, but also the capitalist Democratic Party, which every single time they get a chance, they stab us in the back and they pretend that it was somebody else's fault. But we need to recognize it was them. And if we're able to make that pivot and recognize that our true power is not through the ballot box alone, but through real workplace organizing and community organizing, then we'll be able to start to grow that power needed to make real change in this country.
And one of the pressing issues is still the COVID pandemic. And there are reports now that the government has cut off funding for testing of people. People are being charged to be COVID tests. It seems like they don't have any money for continued protection against this pandemic, yet it seems like they have unlimited budget for the military, $100 billion for Ukraine. It seems like there's a bipartisan interest in keeping this war going, the military-industrial complex, while working people in this country aren't even being protected if they're poor against the pandemic. I mean, it seems like these are basic different priorities for the people of this country versus who's running this country.
Yeah, unlimited money for war, absolutely. Even if those weapons and those guns are handed directly to the Nazi Azov battalion, which of course is incorporated into the Ukrainian army. So the military-industrial complex, the capitalist class in this country is happy to reap those unlimited benefits when it suits their interests, right? Those unlimited resources. But when we talk about COVID, when we talk about public health, what we really need to be talking about is universal health care. We got to be talking about things at minimum, like national single-payer health care. What we really need to do is beyond that to have a true national healthcare system, socialized medicine. But, you know, as a starting point, we need to make sure every single person has healthcare and also has paid sick days, not just railroad workers, but every single worker. Here in Vermont, one thing that we are proud of is that we do have universal mandated sick leave, 5 days a year for every worker in the state that you earn through your employment every year. It's not perfect. We need more, but it's a start. It is sickening that is not, at minimum, the case in the rest of the United States of America. It is absolutely sickening that in most states in this country, many states in this country, poor children are not getting adequate health care, for that matter. These are moral failures that are also economic failures, but they're not out of necessity. They're out of a lack of prioritizing working people. And again, that's because our two major political parties are both in the camp of the large ownership class, the capitalist class, the billionaires, the millionaires, and neither of them represent the interest of working people.
And one other issue on this strike, which I didn't bring up, and that is that the Liz Schuler, who's president of the AFL-CIO, said that it was a good agreement. She commended the agreement, even though it was not voted down really by the majority of railway workers. Why would the head of the AFL-CIO basically pretend that this agreement was supported by the workers, the members of the railroad workers unions?
Well, look, I'm president of the Vermont AFL-CIO, not the National AFL-CIO. I was not privy to those conversations going on in Washington. I have not talked with President Schuler about this emerging situation, so I don't want to put words in her mouth. Now, when the union bargaining teams months ago came to a tentative agreement, I would assert to anybody that would ask that it was up to the workers and their ratification process if that was a good deal or not. I was silent during that time, as I think was appropriate as a labor leader, because I wanted to see how the workers themselves voted, right? I think that's their decision to make. But when 4 unions voted down, rank and file union members voted down those contracts, and those 4 unions represent a majority of the rail workers impacted by this agreement, then we have all of us, all working class people, have a moral and political obligation to back them in their democratic decision to reject that agreement. If we would have got Congress to put in the paid sick days, I think that would have been a win. But that was a failure. And again, that was a failure of and by the Democratic Party, done intentionally to support the interests of the billionaire class.
One of the issues that you've raised in Vermont, as far as transforming your council and the membership, is democracy, democratic structuring, and you've been fighting for that. What does that mean for a democratic trade union movement? Because, of course, a lot of unions are organized similar to corporations, top-down, corporate, appointed officials. Basically, the rank and file membership in many unions don't even vote for their national leaders.
Well, the struggle, we got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And the same time where we're trying to fight for a more powerful working class movement in this country, a more powerful labor movement, we also have to fight within our own unions, within our own internationals, within our own locals to democratize them. If we're going to ask people to go to the barricades, if we're going to even get to the place where we could more often and more reasonably discuss the power of wildcat strikes, then we need rank and file members, not just hundreds of them, not just thousands, but millions of rank and file members to feel a sense of ownership over the labor movement, over their own unions. Because if you're going to ask them to go to the barricades, if you're going to ask them to put down their tools, they have to feel they're a part of that decision. They don't feel part of that decision when they vote on something, and then be it through an act of Congress or through another mechanism, it becomes imposed on them. That's the opposite of democracy. Now, in this case, it was the government that imposed the agreement. And we're right to call out the government as the bad player, the bad actor in this situation. So all I'm trying to say, Steve, is we have to fight to democratize our own unions. We have to strive towards one member, one vote. And we have to strive towards a more participatory democratic process when it comes to defining the priorities and the struggles that the unions engage in. But at the same time, we can't just do that. We also have to fight against those economic and political interests that oppose us on the national scale, external to the labor movement.
And your union or your council was the only one in the country that, well, actually, there were some other labor councils that called for a general strike if there was an attempted coup or insurrection. Mm-hmm. And there was an effort to shut you down, to threaten you with trusteeship. This growing fascist movement in this country is not going away, regardless of what happens to Trump. It seems that this debate that you began and some other councils began is not really going on in the labor movement, the rise of fascism, what to do about it. How do you see making this a debate for millions of workers in this country? Because the fascists are armed, they're organized, and they're trying to terrorize workers. They're even trying to terrorize people not to vote. I mean, by showing up at voting polls.
You fight fire with fire, Steve. We need a militant labor movement to counter a militant and dangerous far right that's growing in this country. I'm not going to belittle the danger the far right still poses here. It's immense, and democracy is precarious. And we need to be willing to go to the mat. We need to do whatever it takes to defend the democracy we have and fight to gain more democracy. It's not good enough just to rest on our laurels. We must fight to expand those democratic expressions that workers have. But as a labor movement, we need to start to have those discussions now, as we have in Vermont, all throughout the country, at the local level, at the Central Labor Council level, at the State Labor Council level, and at the national level. We can't wait until the wake of the 2024 election, if a crisis was to emerge, for example, to then have an existential debate about how we're going to fight back. We've taken our basic steps here in Vermont to try to democratize our labor movement, thus getting more rank and file members involved in the decision-making process and owning the political decisions we make. We've taken steps to organize Anti-Fascist Motorcycle Club here in the state to also help our sergeant at arms to provide security as needed. And we've worked hard to build community relationships, because we can't just be an island. We have to work in conjunction with other democratic and popular forces around the United States of America if we're going to be able to push back against the far right, which has backing of large sections of the wealthy classes.
And you have billionaires, Elon Musk. There's going to be a rally at Twitter. Get your ticket to Mars on Human Rights Day. There's Larry Ellison of Oracle. There's Bezos. There are billionaires now who would like to see a different kind of rule, dictatorship, in many ways. You know, they supported Trump, and they supported a coup. Peter Thiel's another one. What do you think that the response of the working class should be to these people who are basically organizing for a insurrection to overthrow the government?
Well, look, billionaires, the existence of one billionaire can only happen because of the poverty of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of others. That's just the reality. There's so much wealth in a society. And when you concentrate it in one place, that means children in St. Louis are going hungry. That means kids in Kansas City can't afford to get breakfast, right? So we recognize, or one must recognize, that gross inequality, excessive wealth, is another way of saying excessive poverty. In the wealthiest country in the world, we fail in comparison with other industrialized countries when it comes to basic metrics such as lifespan, such as infant mortality rates. So of course we could do better. Of course we must. And we can't be afraid of terms like wealth redistribution, because I'll tell you what, Steve, that's what we have right now. We have wealth distribution where my labor, your labor, is going to enrich the billionaire class, the Jeff Bezos of the world. That is wealth redistribution. We need to redistribute some back to those with their own hands, with their own efforts, are the ones that actually create things in society, which then produces wealth. We can't be ashamed of that. That's core to the struggle ahead.
But it seems like as long as we have the Democratic Party, which the unions are supporting, that's not going to happen. I mean, they did promise national health care, the Democrats.
But they promised a lot of things. I mean, come on. I mean, how many times can they promise something, and then we're going to act surprised when they don't deliver? We're going to act surprised when they fuck over the rail workers? I mean, come on. So look, we start with whatever steps we can take. Here in Vermont, for the last general election, we endorsed 17 candidates in total, statewide. 15 of those won. We endorsed the entire third party, Vermont Progressive Party slate, which is a Democratic Socialist Party, essentially. They largely won. We endorsed a very small number of Democrats who are straight up labor champions, type of people I'm not ashamed to be friends with, type of people you could rely on. I think there was 8 of them. Right, 8 of them. In years past, we endorsed 150. They all won, and we got nothing in return. So now we've gone back to the roots of saying we're only going to actually support people who are with us. And instead of sinking annual money, as we used to, into lobbying efforts, we've taken that money and put it towards organizing, right? Because that's where we're going to build our real power. Now, look, Vermont in and of itself is never going to change the world, nor is New Hampshire, nor is Maine, nor is Massachusetts, nor is New England in aggregate. But we have to strike at the chains that bind us where we live, right? We have to break the link of the chain where we live. We are striving here in the Green Mountain State to show how we could break some of these chains and do things different, right? And that's what we see happening in all different little parts all across the country. Now we have to bring them together. This is what CTU, the Teachers Union in Chicago, they've been fighting what you would term social justice unionism, where they're in alliance with the community around them to change not only the lives of teachers and school support staff, but also for the betterment of the working class and poor communities that they serve. That's what we see happening with the Teachers Union in LA. So we see reform movements within labor all across the country, with the election of a reform candidates just the other day, it looks like for the UAW national leadership, which is a big deal, with Sean O'Brien as head of the Teamsters. So change is afoot. Now, the question is, can we bring it together and coalesce around a true movement for equity and democracy, not just in pockets, not just in cities, not just in a state? Can we learn from each other, coordinate it, and make an effort for fundamental national change?
You mean a united front around class struggle issues?
Yes.
That is, I think, what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
More and more unity, but it seems like that's being forced on the working class more and more as it faces these struggles.
Well, I mean, history also shows us that the material conditions are going to define how the movement, how the struggle evolves. It's not a mistake that it was during the Great Depression that saw some of the most militant and effective labor organizing going on in this country. And it's not a mistake that today labor has become dynamic and widely supported at levels that it never has been in the modern era, according to public opinion polls. As we see the most concentration of wealth that's happened in the United States since the late 1920s. These things are not accidents, they're not coincidental. The material conditions are driving the mechanisms for change.
And if people want to find out more information about the efforts of Vermont AFL-CIO, what can they do? How do they get in touch with you?
We have a website. Please do an internet search for the Vermont AFL-CIO. Be sure to click About Us, and then our 10-point program for union power will come up, also known as our Little Green Book. If you reach out to us, feel free to ask, and we might even be able to send a couple in the mail. Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with David Van Deusen, president of the Vermont AFL-CIO, who's been the most forward activist within the national labor movement, fighting for workers' rights and challenging not only the rise of fascism, but the political problem that labor is facing with the Democratic Party. So thanks for joining us, David. Solidarity, Steve.